This episode of Bullet Heaven was made possible with a copy of the game provided by Retrosumus. Well, would you look at that? Here we are with the first Dreamcast game of 2021, which is something no one ever really expects to hear, but hey, it makes us feel pretty good. This time, though, we're checking out a shooting game that turns a lot of conventions on their heads, from its controls right down to its presentation. Xenocider was developed and published by Retrosumus and found its way to the Sega Dreamcast on January 25th, 2021, after a 7-year development cycle. As one of the only 3D indie games and the sole 3D indie shooting game to see release on the Dreamcast, what makes this title tick? Let's take a closer look. Xenocider may sport a passing resemblance to Sega's Space Harrier or Afterburner at a glance, which of course makes sense as Xenocider is heavily inspired by both. But its gameplay is vastly different, especially on the control front. Think more Charge and Blast than Space Harrier. Players going into this game are going to find a control scheme that will feel extremely obtuse on the outset and will require quite a bit of retraining to get used to it all. Rather than a typical 3D rail shooter, Xenocider falls more in line with a fixed shooter, as players can only really move left and right, and even then, the D-pad and analog stick aren't even used. Rather, players move the game's protagonist, Zara, between 5 preset tracks using the shoulder triggers by default. The L and R triggers will move Zara left or right by 1 track respectively with each pull. This rigid movement system gives way to aiming Zara's crosshair freely using the D-pad or analog stick. There is a small degree of auto-aim when in the vicinity of an enemy, which should assist players in scoring quicker kills. However, because of the rigidity of Zara's actual movement, avoiding certain attacks will definitely require a degree of strategy and knowledge of the stage being attempted. Thankfully, this is more than achievable, especially as players come to grips with each stage's enemies and flow. But there are also some hazards which, from time to time, will need to be cleared by jumping over them. By default, this is handled with the Y button, but we found that in some cases, Zara's jump would often come up short, resulting in damage a good 80% of the time. If that wasn't enough, some items can only be collected with a jump. This is either an extremely uncommon, if not entirely unique mechanic in rail shooters, so it definitely shakes things up. We just wish that the duration of her jumps was just a tiny bit longer. Speaking of shaking things up, even the act of firing is a little different here too. Instead of holding a button to continuously fire, Zara's shots are toggled on or off with a single press of the A button by default. The same goes with Zara's Xenopods, which come in 3 flavors: Shoot for extra blasters, Nuke for a screen clearing and heavily damaging attack, and Shield, which engages a barrier to avoid taking damage. 2 of these can be equipped at a time before starting each stage, each with their own dedicated button for activation. After being deployed, a cooldown period will be engaged, and they'll become unusable until their gauges fill back up. These Xenopods are instrumental in making efficient progress through the game, so finding a combination that works best will be quite beneficial. But it goes further. Zara's Xenopods and her armor can be upgraded between stages using collected Xenocoins that can be earned in every stage. They'll increase the selected attribute by 1 unit. Collecting Dreamcasts in the middle of the stage, defeating bosses, and perfectly clearing bonus phases will award 1 coin each. Zara can even use these coins for extra lives, which can be very helpful in later stages. It is always recommended to upgrade her armor by at least 1 unit per stage though, as it will help in surviving the more troublesome enemy patterns, hazards, traps, and bosses as the game progresses. Because when a player gets hit, Zara's armor will be worn down. This can be recovered with life pickups dropped by certain enemies. However, if Zara's armor is reduced to 0, she'll lose a life and the entire stage will need to be attempted again. But this can also lead to an interesting scenario. Coins collected before dying will be maintained when the stage is cleared. Where only 3 will be obtained on a perfect run, we would end up with 4 or 5 on stages we retried with successful Dreamcast pickups. This basically allowed us to replenish our life stock as if we had never died. Nifty. In the end, the default system works, but it's going to take a while to get used to. At least it did for us. We felt that it was best to keep in mind that the position of the buttons on a standard Dreamcast pad correlates to Zara's actions in-game. X and B for the left and right Xenopods respectively, with the jump map to Y and gunfire to A. but of course this can all be changed in the options if the player so desires. But with all of that said, there's also a bit of a disconnect between each main stage and the bonus phases that punctuate them post-boss, since the controls shift completely into a style more in line with a game like Space Harrier. Xenocider features Star Fox-style ship-based post-stage segments with typical rapid-fire enabled by holding down the fire button, and a fixed mode with precise left or right movement tasking players with taking out all targets before they reach the player. Meanwhile, Stage 7 of the main game also plays very much like Space Harrier as well. In all of these cases, the D-pad and analog stick will be used for direct movement, which freshens things up and ends up being much easier to complete compared to the vast majority of the rest of the game. In total, Xenocider plays over the course of 7 stages, 6 of which feature alternate paths for players to take on. Some paths are definitely going to be harder than others, but they are not especially long, allowing players to get familiar with and memorize their layouts for a smoother progression, which ended up being successful for us as we did manage a 1cc when filming. Granted, a 1cc is all players can achieve, as there is no way to continue a run if Zara runs out of lives. The main game serves up a decent enough challenge, but Xenocider also features 3 additional game modes for players looking for a little more out of this particular title. First up is Fantasyland, which plays more or less identically to Space Harrier, complete with all kinds of similar enemy types and bosses. Fantasyland has the kind of control we expected in the first place, and it felt very natural. Next up is Simulation Mode, which has players endlessly mow down various enemy formations in an attempt to go as long as possible without letting any through. It starts off easy enough but gets pretty difficult over time. This is a great competitive mode, and it can go as long as the player can. Finally, we have Maniac Mode, which allows players only very limited power-ups on the outset of the game only. Each stage is extended and remixed with more scoring opportunities and a more arcadey flow. This is a mode that's perfect for experts to really dig into. All good, but we also discovered a couple of issues as well. First up, we noticed that some stages seem to be a little mixed up. On Transistor Highway, for example, the stage descriptor says to watch out for buzzsaws and pistons on Route 2. But Route 1 was the path with more buzzsaws or any pistons at all. This had us wondering whether what we were reading was going to be accurate at all in future stages, so we ended up leaving our progression to trial and error rather than a tactical choice based on the presented text. We also encountered an error where the game would refuse to save, nullifying a sizable chunk of progress when the game needed to be reset. Additionally, the VMU couldn't be found at all when attempting to use the Dream Connection 2 adapter to play with a Saturn controller instead of a stock Dreamcast pad. Issues aside, there's a lot to like about Xenocider, and while its controls are certainly going to be the main sticking point and some issues are rather glaring, it still works well enough with a bit of dedication to be fun in the end. Of course, its extra modes definitely elevate its staying power in great ways, especially since they feel vastly different in some cases. Xenocider does employ a fairly basic scoring system to each playable mode included in this release, some of which are more involved than others. The main story mode, for example, does not actually display the player's score as their run is in progress, showing the player's totals only between stages and after their run comes to an end. Basically, just destroying as many enemies as possible will get the player's point totals up to a decent amount. Of course, additional bonuses for the number of kills, how much armor is left, the amount of lives remaining, coins collected, xenopods used, and health collected are also tallied and added at stage end to form a stage total. Things are a little different in Maniac Mode, as players will earn more points per kill by taking out foes quickly without getting hit. The player's score is visible in this mode, and a gauge that fills up with better kill performance will award more points to the player the more it is filled. Get hit, and the gauge will reset. The same stage end bonuses also apply here, but are taken to higher extremes thanks to the length of the stages in this mode. Fantasyland scores more directly with no stage end bonuses, but in this mode a good score will lead to a number of extends to allow the player more chances at recovering from a miss. Unlike the main story mode and Maniac modes, Fantasyland features one-hit kills, so having a stock full of extends is always a solid strategy for success. Finally, Simulation Mode also features a direct scoring system with nothing in the way of significant bonuses. Basically, the further the player can get without letting an enemy through, the better their score will be. There's no online ranking here, of course, but a local leaderboard is also absent. Thankfully, the player's top scores are saved to the VMU and will be displayed when the player's run comes to an end. The top score is also displayed at all times in Fantasyland and Simulation Mode. All in all, there's nothing special to Xenocider's scoring systems, but it works well enough for what it is. It's not mind-blowing, but it's also not at all bad. Xenocider's presentation is a pretty big deal. It's the only indie shooting game on the platform that features 3D visuals, and that's something that sets it immediately apart. Xenocider has VGA compatibility, meaning that some seriously crispy polygonal visuals can be had with the right hookups. We gotta say, this is easily the best looking indie title on the system to date. It just has to be said. Especially with some stages like Sakura's Realm, Xenocider's visual chops can be very impressive, even if the background here does cheat a bit with a choppy 2D animated image. Players are going to find that there will still be stuttering and a touch of slowdown in some places, but on the whole, Xenocider runs well at 60 frames per second. The exception to all of this, though, is the extensive FMV that is employed in many places throughout the game. It would look stellar on a CRT, but through an upscaler on a modern monitor, not so much. Still, it's a great throwback to a time when FMV was used to fill in cinematic gaps with high-quality imagery that the system in question couldn't pull off in real time. We wish we could say the same about the sound, but it has its issues. A lot of the VO clips, the communication effects, and some sound effects tended to get annoying to the point of frustration over time. And some of the music tracks left a bit to be desired. Still, on the whole, the sound set works here, and we know that others might like it more than we do. The extras in Xenocider really enhance its presentation though. A complete Space Harrier style game and a Star Fox style minigame add a lot of value and a good amount of variety to the overall package. It's like getting 2.5 games in one. Xenocider is also packed with all kinds of Easter eggs and visual nods all over the place, which can be fun to pick apart. There are also a set of in-game achievements as well, adding even more for completionists to do. A simple menu system as well as several options for sound, controls, and more round out the presentation. So, how does Xenocider stack up? Let's take a look. Xenocider's controls are very challenging to get used to, so some time is definitely going to be required to acclimate. Modes like Fantasyland and Simulation feel much more natural. A lot of the difficulty in Xenocider is going to come from wrestling with the control scheme, but once it's overcome, a 1cc shouldn't take long to achieve. Xenocider's main scenario sports 7 stages with branching paths for all but the final stage. Fantasyland, Maniac Mode, and Simulation add to Xenocider's staying power, and in-game achievements boost replayability. The 3D polygonal visuals at play in Xenocider are excellent, and its solid frame rate is generally great. Some background elements are choppy though, and the FMV, while period accurate, look quite dated. The mostly great soundtrack may not do enough to drown out the often irritating VO and communication effects, but the sound is otherwise good. Xenocider is a love letter to Sega and the kinds of games we once saw on the Dreamcast at the turn of the century. It does some great things given the platform that it's on, with a few twists to the formulas that it pays homage to, but it also ends up feeling maybe just a bit too familiar at times. Obtuse controls notwithstanding. Xenocider will set players back between 15 and 60 euros depending on whether they choose digital or physical regular or special editions. Even at its most expensive at this time, Xenocider is still a worthwhile purchase though. Fans of the Dreamcast should definitely get right on this. Xenocider is ultimately a fun game, and definitely a title Dreamcast fans should be taking note of. As the only 3D indie Dreamcast shooting game to date, it fills a hole that has been left since the end of official development all the way back in 2007. It definitely has its issues, especially with its obtuse control, but over time it should be manageable. Other issues like save errors can also hamper the experience. But thanks to its unlockable modes and interesting take on fixed shooting, Xenocider still gets a 3.75 out of 5. You can get a copy of Xenocider on Retrosumus' website in both physical disc form or as a digital package for play on ODEs like GDEMU and Mode. Link in the description below. You know we're going to revisit the Dreamcast again sooner rather than later, but it was great to play on the little white box that refuses to die with a brand new title. Up next on Bullet Heaven, a game anyone at all can get, with a super cute style and an important message. Tadpole Tales is coming right up on episode 295 of Bullet Heaven. See you all in the next episode.